This is a super impressive group of guys, and I find it fascinating that they have a lot they could be doing, but they've chosen to devote themselves to advancing policy in early childhood. So I'd like to start by asking each of you guys to just talk for a few minutes about what motivated you to get involved in this field, what you're doing, and why you're sticking with it. George, do you want to start?
Well, what motivated me to get involved in this issue is the number one predictor for who's going to be in prison at age 18 is the number of words in their vocabulary in kindergarten. So it's the best predictor for who's going to be in prison is the number of words that the kids know when they get to kindergarten. And we have far too many people in prisons in this country. 60% of the people in our prisons can't read. 85% of the kids in the juvenile justice system either read poorly or can't read at all. And we have major learning gaps in our schools. We have school after school across the country that has huge learning gaps between groups of people. And when you look at the issues that actually cause the learning gaps, when you understand the biological science of brain development, what you know is you cannot close the learning gaps at age 15. You have to close them at 15 months. 15 months is the time frame. The first 3 years, the reason this book is called 3 Key Years is because the brains develop in every child in the first 3 years of life. That's when the neurons connect. That's when the brain builds its strength. And the brains that are exercised by having someone talking, playing, reading, interacting with the child are stronger brains, and the brains that don't get that exercise don't build those connections, and by the time they're 4, the brain is actually pruning itself. There's a pruning process that starts at 4 and 5, and so kindergarten is far too late. A lot of people think that kindergarten education begins at kindergarten. Kindergarten is too late. The children who only know a couple of hundred words at age 3 don't catch up. And so what we need to do is move upstream in the process. We cut the death rate from stroke at Kaiser Permanente. We cover 10 million people. We cut the death rate from stroke in half by going upstream in the process and identifying both better treatment and different behaviors on behalf of patients, and the combination of that in a systematic way change the outcomes for stroke. We need to do the same thing here. We need to go upstream in the process and change the number of people who are going to prison by helping the children in the first 3 years of life. And to do that, we need to involve parents. This has to be a parent-involved, parent-based process. And we've done research basically in California, primarily with Medicaid mothers, and identified the fact that almost no mothers know that they can exercise their children's brain and improve the strength of the brain. Most people believe that kids are going to have the intelligence for life that they were granted at birth, that it's a sort of a birthright thing, and whatever you're born with is what the cards you play for your entire life. And what's true is that when you exercise a brain in those first years, brains grow incredibly, tremendously. There's a great opportunity that happens in those years. And when mothers know that, and when fathers know that, they can make different life choices about their children. And we have failed miserably as a country. We have failed at horrible levels by not teaching that to every single parent at that point in time. It has been very disrespectful of the parenting process not to teach that to every parent. It's been something that is logistically flawed to not teach that to every parent, because every parent who knows that, even the parents who have really difficult lives, who have 2 jobs, have terrible transportation issues, all kinds of other issues, armed with that piece of information, can make different incremental choices at various points about their kid's life. So we owe it to every parent to teach that to every parent, and we need to make that part of the process. So I chair First 5 California. We are now in First 5 California trying to figure out ways of getting surround sound to the parents. We're working through the hospitals. Every mother who gives birth in California is going to get a notice in the hospital that describes this process. We're working with faith leaders, we're working with caregivers, we're working with all kinds of community leaders, we're working with daycares. And the superintendent of schools for the state of California is on board, and he's working through the school system, and he's asked the school system to help figure out various ways of getting this information to the schools. And the reason to the early mothers, the reason that the schools are on board and the superintendents are on board is because they're failing in closing those learning gaps. The learning gaps in Oakland right now on the new Common Core measurements, less than 20% of the minority children in the Oakland schools were able to read, and 9% passed the math test. Now, if we intervened with all of those children in the first years of life, we could get 90% to pass that test. That's the difference. We can completely transform their lives if we get involved earlier, but no one has taught the parents that this is even possible. So that's the message. That's the message of the book. The book is we have to get to every single parent. We have to support the parents in this process. If we can do it with nurse coaching and all kinds of other infrastructure, that's wonderful. If we do nothing other than inform the parent, that all by itself is wonderful because it creates a more informed parenting. So that's why, as I've been looking at the future of the country, we're at a place right now where the average working mother reads to her child between birth and kindergarten 1,500 hours. The average Medicaid mother in America reads to her children between birth and kindergarten an average of under 30 hours. 1,500 versus 30. And when you look at the births in America this year, 51% of the births are to Medicaid mothers. So do the math, look at that future, and get a sense of where we're going if we don't intervene in that trajectory. And it's pretty clear. So as a business leader, I led the Bay Area Coalition of Business Leaders on Early Childhood Development. Business leaders in the Bay Area get it. We want future employees to be employable. And so it's about the future of the country, it's about the future of business, and we need to deal with this issue. So that's why I'm personally involved. And enjoy the book and pass the book on. And if you have anyone who is a new mother or a new father, you can give them the book and guarantee that they will have smarter and happier kids if they follow the instructions in that book.
Thank you, George. John?
Good morning. I suspect everyone here has had a meeting, been at a speech, read a book that you look back on and say it changed your life. One of those occurred to me 30 years ago in 1986 here in Washington. I was attending a dinner which I wish I didn't have to be at for the National Alliance of Business and a speaker who I hoped would be blessedly short in his remarks. And it was Assistant Secretary of Labor, and I'd just come back from running Proctor's business in Europe. And his subject at night was the development of our youth. And what he described was a picture that if we didn't change the way we were developing our youth, very youngest age, we would be a country in deep trouble. And he painted a dreadful picture, and I went up to him afterwards and I said, if your purpose was to alarm me, you've succeeded. What would you suggest? And I don't remember exactly what he said. In any event, I decided I'd come back and make what really became, outside of my work and my family, the kind of the cause of my life for the next 30 years, which was education. And we formed something called the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative, which was focused on preschool education, working with Governor Voinovich, who was then the governor of Ohio, and on mentoring and tutoring and teacher training. So we've been at it ever since. Of course, when he was talking, we didn't yet have China opening up. We didn't have India opening up. We didn't have Eastern and Central Europe, all the competition that now exists for young people. Very sadly, the predictions that he made that night have proved altogether too true. The dropout rates that he cited that we had then of 25% have not gone down. We are now the 12th country in terms of kids going on to college. When he made that talk, we were number one. What's kept me going? A lot of what you've heard George talk about, It's the science, the understanding that the brain is being built. And every time we go out to talk this with business people now, we want to start with the science. We want to start as clearly as we can with what's actually happening in the brain as it is built, and it's not something that just happened at birth. I'd say the two things that have kept me going have been the combination of really the ravages of poverty and the impact it's having on the development of children, and the wonderful good news and what we're seeing from proven programs for preschool education. I won't spend a lot of time on the ravages of poverty. You all know it. We all know it. It's worse now than ever. 42% of the kids in Cincinnati are living in poverty-stricken households. You've heard the numbers about the moms on Medicaid and the percentage that are on Medicaid. It really matters. There's a PSI test. We keep seeing we're in the bottom half. But if you take school districts where less than 10% of the children are in federally subsidized programs, less than 10%, they test the highest in the world. And if you want to take that the other side, where 75% of the kids are in federally subsidized programs, we are the lowest of any developed country in the world. If you were born about 25 years ago and you were in the lowest median of income, you know what percentage of those youngsters growing up who go on to college? 8%. If you go back to 1970, the percentage of kids in the highest quartile of income graduating from college have gone from 44 to 78%. 44 to 78% since 1970. But if you take the lowest quartile, that's gone from 6 to 9%. Why in heaven's name? Why in heaven's name should we allow the herd of poverty to intervene in a child's life when my grandchildren are in preschool when they're 2, not 3, not 4? And while China has undertaken a policy of having 70% of all of its children not get 1, not 2, but 3 years of preschool, and they have the money to do it, and a command structure through their legislature. We've learned a lot in the last 10 years that should encourage us, but it should give us also a sense of urgency. For every year we fail to do this, and right now only about a quarter of the children who deserve this, only about a quarter of the children are getting. This is crazy when we have programs that are proven to work. They're proven now with any number of analysis to pay out. You pick your number, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, the kind of thing that any business leader would sign off on in a millisecond, knowing that it was the key to the future. So we've got a lot to do. We've learned a lot. I've reached the point where I know it will happen because the urgency is so clear, but it's taking way too long. It's taking way too long, and it'll take all voices. It'll take business voices. It'll take the voices that I'm sure so many of you in this room who I don't know, who've been lifetime advocates for this. You're doing it every day. But we've got to make it happen. I call it our social, moral, and economic imperative of our generation. People sometimes ask me, what do you worry about in your advanced age? They may not say in your advanced age, but that's probably what they think. And I say it's really two things. One, are we going to be able to come together as the countries of this world to fight the things that threaten our very civilization? Nuclear proliferation, terrorism, which we're seeing in our midst right here yesterday. Are we going to come together and stop fighting with one another and actually come together as we should? The other is the one we're talking about here. Are we going to act on what we know to be true about the development of our young people, which is the future of this country? Every child deserves this. We have a Declaration of Independence. We talk nobly about everyone having God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We mouth these words, we believe them, but don't act on them right now. Fortunately, we've got programs today we know work. They're proven. We'll keep learning, but we need to go make them happen. I've seen businessmen care and women care more about this than any other issue, perhaps than taxes, other than taxes. And they do because they see how important it is to the future of the society in which we live. Yes, the workforce, but it's more than the workforce. We do have 10 million people unemployed today, and we have 4 million jobs we can't fill. How's that? 10 million unemployed, 4 million jobs. Microsoft has to go outside this country to recruit people because we aren't developing. It starts, as George said, at these earliest years, 0 to 3, 0 to 5.
Thanks, George.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. I want to start by saying, Katharine, I don't know what I did to you to make me go last after these two gentlemen, but I appreciate you having me here. I can tell you how I got started in early childhood. It was really not so dramatic and not so interesting. I was sitting in my office in Middletown, Ohio, and I was reading the Wall Street Journal like I do a lot of mornings early before everybody started coming in. And on the front page of Wall Street Journal that morning was an article about Every Child Succeeds. It's a home visitation program in Cincinnati. It serves about 3,000 moms and children a year, 6,000 total. And they talked about the wonderful work they were doing. But they also talked about, and this is the reason why they were on the front page of Wall Street Journal, they talked about how the business of Every Child Succeeds was actually run. And I call it a business because it was in Wall Street, and that's what I thought I was reading, was about businesses. But it was a program that was started out with a number of different components, and in particular, it would start out with a very strong research component because they were part of Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is a very strong research institute. And they also started out with a lot of Procter & Gamble DNA, thanks to Mr. Pepper here. And they tracked things like a business. They tracked things like return on investment. They tracked things like results and what their value is. And they stopped doing things that didn't work, and they did more of things that did work. And I was really fascinated. And I was a little disheartened to think that this was a nationally recognized organization, literally just a few minutes down the road from my office that I had never heard of, but I was very glad to have read that article that day. And that led me to meet with the president of that organization, Dr. Judy Van Ginkel, who's been there since the beginning. And she and I came in and we talked for a while and had a great conversation. She's one of those people where you meet her for the first time and you have these 2-hour conversations and you can't even believe where time went. And when we left, we did what we so often have done is we talked a little more socially and we talked about our favorite books. And she said, here, you got to have a copy of this. Take it with you. It's called Inside the Brain by Ron Kodolak. And again, I have to give John credit for that book, or maybe Francie, your wife, which was some of the genesis of how Every Child Succeeds got started. And it is I can tell you, it's a very easy to read book, but it contains a lot of good science about brain development, and I would highly recommend it. I think I have personally sold hundreds of copies of that book because of how good it is and how much I recommend it. But it pales in comparison to the thousands that John has probably sold or given away. And it really is, I would call it basic required reading. If you're in this business or you have an interest in this subject, I would read Inside the Book by Ron Kodolak, because it is the science behind what George and John and I all care about so much. And it's very compelling, but it is also very readable. That started a decade or so long working with Every Child Succeeds and getting more involved in every childhood. But I want to start from the beginning as a businessman, too, where I got involved, because I had been earlier in my career kind of involved in all sorts of cradle to career issues and initiatives, and really felt like this was a maze I'm not sure I could figure out how to navigate. There's so many pieces going on, so many things that don't work and do work. And what I found most compelling was as I became involved in a group in Southwest Ohio called Business Leaders for an Educated Workforce. So Business Leaders for an Educated Workforce. So I thought, I want to get involved in this because, just as John said, I'm having trouble and have had trouble for the last 10 years filling positions. And I'm not talking about positions that require even bachelor's or master's degrees. I'm talking about positions that would require a high school diploma and some amount of certification, training, education, 2 years or less is by far the vast majority of my employees. And the ones that I've had trouble employing, whether unemployment rates were 10% or 5%, and they're less than 5% in Ohio, and I can tell you it hadn't made a difference. It hadn't made it any harder. It's just as hard as it's ever been filling those positions. So I got involved in that group. And I also kind of wondered what we were going to decide and do. Well, this group set about having a series of meetings over a year and a half about mostly what many of us businessmen cared about, which was, I'm having trouble filling these positions. And we started brainstorming and talking about how to do that. And we had many members of the community outside of business leaders as well. We had the presidents of the local universities, including the community college, which is a very large community college in Dayton called Sinclair. And we had these conversations. And through this process, there was a number of things we talked about. And as businessmen, we started talking about root causes and how do we get to what is the real problem and how do we solve it. And in my business, my business is primarily manufacturing and transportation. Well, in manufacturing, one of the leading thoughts of school about manufacturing is called the Toyota way. Toyota has taught a ton of manufacturing businesses much of what they know about how to do business in manufacturing, how to create great processes, great quality products, and great customer satisfaction. And one of their tenets is what's called the 5 whys. And it's very simple. They say if you come upon a problem in a manufacturing process, you've got to ask the question why 5 times before you get to the root cause. And that's what it takes to get down to that very root cause where you start to solve things. And I started thinking about, this educated workforce issue kind of in the way I thought about manufacturing. And so this is a social issue, and we talk about at-risk kids, but unfortunately my business mind doesn't always work that way initially. So as I started doing the 5 whys, I said, we have a global competitiveness problem in this country. We have now for years, we get, I think, biannual or every 3 or 5 years the PISA scores. Is that right, Sarah? To show our global competitiveness, with the future workforce. And we keep slipping and slipping in science and math and reading so that we're now, ranking in the teens or low 20s in every aspect, in every subject matter versus the rest of the world. And countries like Finland are beating us handily with their scores. And so global competitiveness is certainly an issue. And in my own hometown, my ability to fill those positions and be competitive was an issue. And what we began to look at was a couple things. Well, we need those kids to come out of high school and get that additional education, training, certification, whatever it might be. So we started working with the local community college to have what amounts to a college promise. So if you live in the county, we'll guarantee that you have access to up to 2 years of schooling of some sort, or education or training, for free. And we also were certainly the last dollar in, but we wanted to make sure that that was possible for everybody. This harkens back to, we all are created equal. We just got to pick at which time that is. But mostly what we want to do is create equality of opportunity. And that's really important. So that was one of the 2 things that we decided that was going to be a focus. We wanted to make sure that we figure out a way locally to have a solution to our local problem. And then we started saying, well, how do we get those successful kids into those kind of training certification programs? And the one thing we found was it's really important to have a high school diploma, not a GED. We know from some studies that a person with a GED has the same earnings potential lifetime as a dropout. And some of it is what we know to be those skills that we talk about as deeper learning skills or executive function skills. There's the skills that are math and science are important, but these are the skills that we all think about when we deal with our kids, for instance. These are delayed gratification. These are the collaborative skills. These are the communication skills, the team building skills. If you're a kindergarten teacher, you know one, you ought to talk to them about their incoming class and say, can you tell which of these kids are going to be good and are going to be high learners, and you can tell which of the ones that are going to struggle, and we might have to have some special education in the future. They might be grade repeaters. They might even be juvenile delinquents. Can you tell this early? Yep, they can tell. So what we also found was high school diploma is important. We found high school graduates are pretty closely correlated through research with ninth grade test scores, also with eighth grade test scores. And then we started to find out that eighth and ninth grade test scores are highly correlated to third grade reading, that critical transition where children go from learning to read to reading to learn. And in fact, third grade reading scores are very critical to eighth and ninth grade math scores. So now we're at third grade, and I'm thinking, okay, we go through the local school systems and we see third grade reading scores, and of course one of my colleagues there says, well, we've got bad third grade reading scores in these school systems. We need to go talk to the second grade teachers. They're obviously not doing their jobs. Of course that's not the case. And then what we found was, what we all know, is that kindergarten readiness scores are highly correlated to third grade reading. And you can see where I'm going. I'm almost getting to my fifth why. I've gone through a few of them now. But what we start to find is, as George and John talked about, is these early years are so important. And this is where that book, Inside the Brain, came in to my thinking. And to read about how, and we've all got great statistics, to read about how fast the brain develops in those early years. 700 synapses formed every second at the height of brain activity being developed. And as George says, if we don't develop it in those early years, later on, just very early later on, before they get to kindergarten, the brain starts pruning itself. It's a natural process that says, if I'm not using this part of my brain, let's get rid of it. Let's stop sending energy there. If you tape somebody's eyes closed, the part of the brain that interprets vision is going to shut down. Mm-hmm. That's what happens with the brain. And that's what happens so often with these young at-risk children, is we don't give them a chance to have a foundation to be successful. And we can't solve it later on. What we also know is how expensive solving it later on is. How expensive special education is. Special education costs as much as a regular school year, and most school systems are very close to it. So if in Ohio we spend about $12,000 a year per child per school year, special education is almost $10,000. 1 year of home visitation is, in Ohio, at Every Child Succeeds, is just over $3,000. And let's go back even further. Let's just talk fiscally a little bit. So at Every Child Succeeds, part of the research we've done that's so compelling to me is things that affect preterm birth and infant mortality and low birth weights. So what we have found, home visitation, if we are able to get a mother prenatally, which is what we try and do every single time, and as George said, 50% of our births in America and certainly in Ohio are Medicaid births. So these are at-risk moms. So if we're able to get them prenatally and get them at least 8 home visits prior to the 3rd trimester, they have a preterm birth rate that is 60% less than a mom that receives 3 or fewer home visits. So I'm not even comparing them to the population that is not even enrolled in these interventions. I'm comparing them to populations that's enrolled that we're not quite able to get a hold of or get enough home visits in. The difference between 8 and 3 home visits prior to the 3rd trimester produces 60% less preterm births. And think about what preterm birth means. Think about the expense, the Medicaid expense of having that child. And you think about the lifelong, both physical health and mental and cognitive and social behavioral issues that child is going to have to deal with. And our communities and their parents and the school systems. So to me, this came down to, this is a basic issue of being globally competitive. And to be globally competitive, for me, as a businessman, I realized through science and research, we got to start all the way back prenatally.
Yep.
And we have taken to calling it 9 to 9, which is prenatal at conception and 9 years old, is so critical. But if we don't put that foundation in early on in brain development, we will never have a chance to get those children to full potential, and we will spend a tremendous amount of money trying to intervene to get them just up to a trajectory that might be what we all would think of as barely acceptable. And so this is, to me, this is a global competitiveness issue. This is a fiscal issue. And I think this is obviously a moral issue. And I'd like to believe that all three of those matter to all of us. And these are compelling reasons why we all need to be more involved in this. And I know this particular group here live are not a lot of businessmen, if any. But I can tell you that we need more businessmen involved in this. We need to have all aspects of the community involved and knowledgeable and hearing the message. So it is important for the providers, the community leaders, the elected officials, the businessmen. This is an issue that affects all of us and should be important to all of us. And I can't tell you how satisfying and how frustrating at the same time it's been for me to be involved in this for a decade, to see great work, but just like business, to see great work that we can't scale up quick enough or high enough to really make the impact that we should. So thanks so much for having us, and I appreciate you all being here.